Florida's death chamber has been busier in 2025 than at any point in decades. From a man who wiped out his entire family in a fit of rage, to another who kidnapped and murdered a teenage girl, to two more who are just weeks away from their own execution dates. These stories reveal the cold, unforgiving reality of death row. In this video, we're stepping inside those final moments. David Joseph Pittman. It was a humid Florida night in the summer of 1990 when the life of 29-year-old Carmen Gayhart was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. She was a young woman known for her warmth, her smile, the kind of person who lit up a room simply by walking into it. But that night, the quiet of her Polk County neighborhood was shattered. What happened inside her home would leave a community horrified, a family devastated, and the justice system entangled in a fight that would drag on for decades. When investigators first entered Carmen's home, the scene was almost too violent to process. Blood spattered across the walls, signs of a struggle in nearly every room. Carmen had been beaten, stabbed, and strangled. The brutality of it all was staggering. This wasn't the work of a stranger passing through. This was personal. Someone had come into her life with rage, and they hadn't left until she was gone. The police didn't have to look far. Suspicion quickly fell on 22-year-old David Joseph Pittman, a man who lived nearby and who had, according to friends, an unstable and sometimes volatile connection with Carmen. Witnesses recalled tensions, whispers of jealousy, and arguments. And then there was the evidence: fingerprints, forensic traces, and the timeline that lined up a little too neatly. But still, nothing about this case would prove simple. When Pittman was brought in, he denied responsibility. Prosecutors, however, painted a chilling picture: a man who had entered Carmen's home under cover of night, who attacked her with his hands and with a knife, who left her lifeless body to be discovered the next morning. They described it as a crime of both violence and domination, a killing that was as much about control as it was about rage. The trial in 1990 gripped the courtroom. Jurors heard about Carmen, about her final moments, about the physical evidence that tied Pittman to the scene. They listened as the state detailed the horrific injuries inflicted upon her. And when the verdict came down, there was no hesitation. Guilty: first-degree murder, burglary, and sexual battery. The sentence: death. For many, that should have been the end. But for David Pittman, it was only the beginning. What followed was one of the longest and most exhausting journeys through the appeals process that Florida had seen in years. Pittman's attorneys raised claim after claim: ineffective counsel, prosecutorial overreach, unreliable witnesses. They argued that the jury had been tainted, that key evidence had been mishandled, that the state had leaned too heavily on circumstantial proof. Each time, the courts reviewed the record, weighed the arguments, and each time, the result was the same: conviction upheld, death sentence affirmed. Still, Pittman refused to give up. The years turned into decades. He became a fixture of Florida's death row at the state prison in Stark. Dozens of other men were executed while his case lingered in appeals. Inmates came and went, guards retired, but Pittman remained, his name popping up every few years in legal filings and appellate rulings. For Carmen's family, those decades were agonizing. Each new appeal meant reopening wounds, hearing her name dragged back into courtrooms, seeing the crime relived again and again in transcripts and testimony. They waited for justice, but it felt like justice kept slipping further and further away. By the early 2000s, Pittman's case had become symbolic. Advocates against the death penalty pointed to him as an example of how the system drags on, leaving inmates in limbo for years. Supporters of capital punishment pointed to the Gayhart family and asked, how long must they wait for closure? The arguments went in circles, but the outcome never changed. And then in 2025, the waiting ended. Florida's governor signed Pittman's death warrant, setting the execution for September 17. The method would be lethal injection, the standard in Florida since the early 2000s. After 35 years of legal wrangling, the state was ready to carry out the sentence. For Pittman, now in his late 50s, the moment was both inevitable and surreal. He had spent nearly his entire adult life behind bars. He had entered prison a young man with a defiant stare, and now, decades later, he was gray, weary, and facing the final countdown. For Carmen's family, The announcement brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief that the process was finally moving forward, but also sadness, grief that had never really gone away. They remembered her not as a victim in court documents, but as the vibrant woman whose life had been stolen. Her laughter, her kindness, her presence, those were the things that stayed with them. As the execution date approached, Pittman's lawyers tried once more to halt it. They argued that his decades on death row were cruel in themselves, that his case reflected systemic issues in the application of capital punishment. But the courts were unmoved. They noted that the delays were the result of Pittman's own appeals, not state inaction. Every claim had been reviewed, every argument had been heard. And so on September 17, 2025, unless a last-minute intervention comes, David Joseph Pittman will be led into Florida's death chamber. He will be strapped to a gurney, IV lines placed into his veins, and as witnesses watch from behind glass, a series of lethal drugs will bring his story to an end. This case is more than the story of a single man's crime. It's about a young woman whose life was stolen, about a family that waited decades for justice, and about a justice system that moves painfully, sometimes unbearably slow. It's about the weight of time, the cost of appeals, and the lingering question of what justice truly means. Carmen Gayhart never saw her 30th birthday. She never had the chance to grow old, to raise a family, to live out her dreams. Her life was ended in violence, and her memory has lived on through the relentless determination of her loved ones. As Pittman's final day arrives, the story comes full circle. One night in 1990 shattered lives and sent shockwaves through a community. 35 years later, the state of Florida prepares to close the book. Whether that brings peace or simply silence is something only Carmen's family can ever truly answer. But Pittman's case is not the only one on Florida's death row that has stirred such emotion. Another man waits for his turn, convicted of a crime that cut even deeper, one that didn't just take a single life, but tore apart an entire family in a way so shocking it left the state reeling. His story, like Pittman's, will make you question the very limits of cruelty and justice. Victor Tony Jones. It was the summer of 1991 in Orlando, Florida. Hot, sticky nights where the city seemed alive with the buzz of neon lights and restless energy. But on one of those nights, violence erupted in a way that would ripple across decades. A man named Edward Feliciano, 35 years old, hardworking and known for his quiet kindness, would never make it home. His life was stolen in a robbery gone wrong, and the man held responsible was Victor Tony Jones. The crime was as sudden as it was senseless. Edward was cornered, robbed, and murdered. Witnesses later described hearing shouting, the sharp crack of violence breaking the night air, and then silence. When officers arrived, they found Edward's body, lifeless, robbed not just of his belongings, but of every tomorrow he was supposed to have. For his family, it was devastation beyond words. They remembered him as a gentle soul, someone who loved his community, who had plans, who had people who loved him deeply. That loss would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The investigation moved quickly. Orlando police tracked down leads, piecing together what happened in those fatal moments. And every path pointed back to one man, 25-year-old Victor Tony Jones. He wasn't a stranger to trouble. Prosecutors would later describe him as a man chasing quick money, someone willing to turn violent if things didn't go his way. Evidence, including witness testimony, tied him directly to Edward's murder. When Jones was finally arrested, the city breathed a little easier, but for Edward's family, the grief had only just begun. The courtroom became the stage for the story of what really happened that night. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, the robbery, the confrontation, and the moment Edward's life was taken. They argued that Jones not only intended to rob, but also to kill. The defense tried to paint another picture, that Jones was caught up in the wrong crowd, that the evidence was not as solid as it appeared. But the jury wasn't persuaded. The weight of the testimony, the crime scene evidence, and the brutality of the murder itself left little doubt. In 1992, the verdict came back, guilty of first-degree murder, and the sentence, death. For most people, that would be the end of the story. But Victor Tony Jones's journey was only beginning. What followed was more than 3 decades of appeals, legal battles, and desperate attempts to overturn his sentence. His lawyers challenged the conviction on multiple fronts: ineffective assistance of counsel, flaws in jury selection, constitutional claims about the fairness of Florida's death penalty system. Each time, the courts reviewed the record, and each time, the sentence stood. Jones became one of the many long-term residents of Florida's death row at the state prison in Stark. Over the years, governors came and went. Executions happened all around him. Some prisoners struck deals or had sentences reduced to life, but not Jones. His appeals were denied, his petitions exhausted. He grew older in a place where time doesn't heal, but only stretches the distance between crime and punishment. For the Feliciano family, every court hearing, every motion, meant reopening wounds. They sat through appeals that replayed the crime in technical detail, listening to arguments about process and procedure, while their loved one's absence remained a daily reality. "We just want closure," one family member was quoted as saying. "We've waited too long already." In 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Jones's death warrant. The date was set, September 30th, 2025. The method: lethal injection. After more than 30 years of waiting, the state was ready to enforce the sentence. As the warrant was announced, news outlets reminded the public of the original crime, of Edward's stolen life, of the decades-long legal fight. For Jones, now in his late 50s, it marked the final chapter. He had entered death row as a young man, hardened and defiant. He would leave it decades later, aged it with the system he had fought finally closing in. In his final days, Jones was moved to the death watch cell, the stark, cold space where inmates spend their last hours under constant observation. He was allowed final visits, a last meal, and the chance to speak his final words. For Edward's family, the execution meant facing their own emotions: relief, sadness, perhaps even questions about whether justice delayed is still justice served. The execution is scheduled to take place inside Florida State Prison's death chamber. Jones will be strapped down to the gurney, IV lines attached, and as witnesses watch from behind glass, the state will administer the lethal injection. For Florida, it is another step in a long line of capital cases. For the Feliciano family, it is the end of a long, painful wait. But this story isn't just about the mechanics of justice, it's about the human cost. Edward Feliciano lost his life in a senseless act of violence. His family lived decades without answers, trapped in the shadow of appeals and hearings. Jones spent more than half his life under the weight of a death sentence, fighting to avoid it, but never escaping it. The case forces us to consider the price of justice, on victims, on families, on the system itself. As September 30th approaches, one thing is clear: the cycle that began on a summer night in Orlando in 1991 is finally reaching its end. Whether it brings peace or just silence is something only the families can decide. But Victor Tony Jones isn't the only one whose execution looms in Florida's calendar. Another man, convicted of a crime that left the state reeling with its sheer brutality, is also waiting for his final date. His case is tangled in controversy, one that has raised disturbing questions about mental illness and the death penalty itself. His story is coming next, and it's one you won't be able to forget. Anthony Wainwright. On the night of April 27, 1994, a quiet Florida community was shattered. 16-year-old Felicia O'Connell, bright, ambitious, and known for her gentle spirit, vanished on her way home. Hours later, the truth emerged. She had fallen victim to a brutal crime at the hands of 23-year-old Anthony Wainwright, a man with a troubled past and a dangerous pattern of behavior. Felicia was a teenager full of life, someone whose family described her as always smiling, always dreaming bigger than the world around her. She had plans for her future, hopes that stretched far beyond the boundaries of her small town. But that April evening, her life was stolen in an act of violence that stunned the entire state. Detectives investigating the case uncovered a timeline that pointed squarely to Wainwright. Witness accounts, forensic evidence, and his sudden disappearance from the area after the crime tied him directly to Felicia's death. The case was built piece by piece, every detail making the picture clearer and darker. When Wainwright was caught, he was defiant. But in court, there was no hiding from the truth. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in painstaking detail. They described how Felicia's last hours had been filled with fear and cruelty, how she was deprived of the future she deserved. The jury listened as the state delivered its case, showing them the hard facts: DNA, physical evidence, and testimony that left little doubt of guilt. The defense attempted to soften the image of Wainwright, pointing to his upbringing, to hardships and instability in his early years. But jurors weren't moved. Nothing, they decided, excused what he had done to a 16-year-old girl whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The verdict was swift: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: death. Felicia's family never truly found peace. At every hearing, at every appeal, they were forced to sit in courtrooms and relive the worst night of their lives. They spoke about her, how she hummed songs when she cooked with her mother, how she dreamed of working with children someday, how she loved riding her bike through the neighborhood. The pain of her absence was unrelenting. Meanwhile, Wainwright remained on Florida's death row for more than 30 years, filing appeals and petitions, each one denied. He became part of the long history of capital cases in the state, his name appearing in legal documents again and again, but the outcome never changed. In 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. The date was set, June 10, 2025. The method: lethal injection at Florida State Prison. On his final day, Wainwright was given the choice of a last meal. He asked for fried chicken, cornbread, and pecan pie. It was a simple, Southern-style request, and one he ate quietly in his cell. When the time came to face the death chamber, he was strapped to the gurney, IV lines attached. As witnesses looked on, he gave his last words. Turning toward Felicia's family, he said he was sorry for the pain, for the years of grief, for the life he had taken. At 6 p.m. on June 10th, the drugs were administered. Minutes later, Anthony Wainwright was pronounced dead. The case left Florida with questions that linger long after the execution. How do you measure justice when a young life is gone? Can decades of legal battles ever truly heal the wounds left behind? For Felicia's family, the answer was bittersweet. They finally had closure, but it came decades too late. Felicia's memory, though, endures. She is remembered not for the tragedy of her death, but for the joy she brought in life. A daughter, a sister, a friend, forever 16. And yet, as the state carried out Wainwright's sentence, another case was already on the calendar. Another man waiting on Florida's death row. His crimes so shocking that they raised new debates, not just about justice, but about the mind of the killer himself. His story is next. Edward Zakrzewski. On a summer night in 1994, a crime unfolded in Okaloosa County, Florida, so savage it still chills people who lived through it. Behind the closed doors of a modest home, Edward Zakrzewski, once seen as a devoted husband, father, and military man, turned into something almost unimaginable. His wife Sylvia, 29 years old, and their two children, 7-year-old Anna and 5-year-old Edward Jr., were killed in a frenzy of violence that left even seasoned detectives shaken. Neighbors would later recall how nothing seemed unusual that day. The Zakrzewski family lived in a quiet subdivision, the kind of place where children rode bikes until dusk. But inside, tensions had been building. Sylvia had been considering ending the marriage. She wanted something different for herself and her children. For Edward, that possibility seemed unbearable. Instead of facing divorce, he chose destruction. What happened inside the home was methodical, yet horrifying. Investigators later testified that Edward first killed his wife, then turned on his children, using both blunt and bladed weapons. The brutality shocked everyone involved in the case. Even the lead detective admitted it was one of the hardest scenes he had ever walked into. A family wiped out not by strangers, but by the very person who was supposed to protect them. For days, Zakrzewski disappeared. Authorities launched a manhunt that stretched across states. He eventually fled to Hawaii, where he tried to start over under a false identity, working odd jobs and moving quietly through island life. But you can't outrun a crime like this. In 1994, he was captured and extradited back to Florida to face justice. The trial in 1996 was tense, emotional, and filled with graphic testimony. Prosecutors laid out their case: a father who planned and executed the murders of his own family to avoid losing control of them. They spoke of premeditation, of rage, of the sheer level of violence. Jurors were shown crime scene photos, listened to forensic experts, and heard the timeline reconstructed piece by piece. The defense tried to cast Edward as a man spiraling under stress, a husband abandoned, a father broken by the threat of losing his children. They leaned on mental health testimony, suggesting depression and emotional collapse. But the jury was unmoved. They saw a man who had choices and who chose the most violent option possible. After deliberation, the verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence? Death. For years, Zakrzewski lived on Florida's death row, his name fading in and out of headlines as appeals worked their way through the courts. His legal team challenged his sentence on multiple grounds: mental illness, ineffective representation, constitutional claims. But each time, courts rejected his petitions. The facts of the crime were simply too overwhelming, the brutality too stark to be overshadowed. Meanwhile, those who knew Sylvia and the children struggled to cope. Friends described Sylvia as gentle, someone who loved books and teaching Sunday school. Anna was shy but bright, already excelling in school, while little Edward Jr. was described as energetic, always smiling. The murders had robbed an entire family line of its future. 3 decades later, in 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Edward Zakrzewski's death warrant. The date was set for July 31st. By then, Zakrzewski was 63 years old, one of the oldest men on Florida's death row. His case had become a grim reminder of how long capital punishment cases can stretch, how decades of appeals keep wounds open for victims' families. In his final days, Zakrzewski was moved to the death watch cell at Florida State Prison. He was given the choice of a last meal, and he chose a hearty plate of pork chops, fried chicken, and pie, a meal that echoed comfort and normalcy even as he awaited the final act of his life. On July 31st, the witnesses filed into the chamber. Family members of Sylvia and the children sat quietly, bracing themselves. Reporters were there too, scribbling notes that would later fill the headlines. Zakrzewski was led in, shackled but calm, and strapped onto the gurney. The IV lines were placed, the microphone lowered for any last words. When asked, he gave only a brief religious statement, invoking his faith before falling silent. No long speech, no attempt at justification. Just a few words before the lethal drugs began to flow. At 6:13 p.m., Edward Zakrzewski was pronounced dead. His execution marked Florida's 8th in 2025, a year in which the state's use of capital punishment drew renewed attention nationwide. For the families of Sylvia, Anna, and Edward Jr., the moment brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was closure in knowing the sentence had finally been carried out, but the deeper truth was inescapable. Nothing could undo what had happened in 1994. 3 lives were gone, a mother and her children who should have grown, laughed, and lived full lives. Their absence could never be replaced. Zakrzewski's case forces us to confront the darkest side of human nature, the capacity for violence not against strangers, but against the people we claim to love most. It leaves behind a trail of questions. What drives someone to such extremes? How does a father become his family's executioner? And what does justice look like 3 decades later, when the man responsible finally meets his own end? What's your own view on this? Thank you for watching.